When disaster strikes, explaining the causes plays a vital part in healing the public hurt. But sometimes, catastrophe defies any rational explanation. That was the story on February the 28th, 1975, in the peak of the London rush hour. It was the day when the name of a railway station became a byword for meaningless destruction. The Moorgate Underground train crash stretched London's emergency services to their limits. The first alerts had come through just before 9. Later, many police and firemen were to say that the awfulness they found down below was beyond imagination.
You start to try and build up a picture in your own mind of the problems and details that you're going to actually be faced with. At Moorgate, the enormity of the situation far outgrew all that. It was bigger than anybody. It's bigger than anybody had ever thought of.
The horror was soon reflected in the numbers of casualties, many with terrible injuries. It was becoming clear that the tube system had suffered its worst tragedy yet.
Everybody sort of looked at each other and wondered what was happening, and the next we knew was the train suddenly came to a dead stop. And I was flung forward about 9 or 10 seats, and I landed with a group of people by the doors, all on top of each other.
Well, it was pitch black.
Yes.
People were picking themselves up, asking each other how they were.
Yes.
A few people were moaning, help me, and things like that.
Yes.
But most of all, people were saying, don't panic, and they didn't panic.
There were 2 ladies trapped by their legs. There was also another lady about a foot. She seemed to be up in the air somewhat. She was lying there, but she was unconscious. And then all of a sudden, somebody started talking, and there was a man, and he seemed to me to be pinned to the ceiling of the train, as if he was on a luggage rack. The force had, knocked him up there.
The train had been Northern Line train 272, leaving Old Street Station before going to Moorgate, the end of the line. The driver was Leslie Newson, a quiet, unassuming family man in his 50s. About 800 metres from Moorgate, the train passed through signals at green. Normally, driver Newson slowed down at this point and coasted into Moorgate. Instead, if anything, the train built up speed, passing another green signal 400 metres later. Just outside the station, the train clattered through a crossover point, still at about 35 instead of the usual 15 miles an hour.
I think the first person to realise something was not right was the signalman on Moorgate platform, who saw the train go past his cabin at rather an excessive speed. I think some of the passengers began to realise that all was not well when they approached Moorgate at a very, very high speed, which caused the car to roll and hit bump stops and so forth.
Instead of stopping, driver Newson took the train straight through the station towards the safety tunnel. He hit a sand drag, then hurtled into a brick and concrete wall 1.5 meters thick. Newson hit the wall at about 35 miles an hour. The carnage was inconceivable. Brian Goodfellow was a young fireman quickly on the spot.
A firefighter from Barbican started to make his way up the escalator, and you could see by the look on his face that there was something big going on. When we got to the platform, silence, people talking, but silence, no clambering, nothing like that. We came down the stairs and we turned to the left, and as we turned to the left, we saw a train carriage, and it was the double doors, a row of seats, and a bulkhead. The other side of that, the driver. That's how we perceived it at that moment in time. Train at the buffers, that's what all we got told, train at the buffers. So we thought, front of the train, buffers are about 10 foot away. And then the word came back that we had 2 more carriages in there, 3 more carriages in there. And we still couldn't build this picture up of how long was this tunnel, where's the buffers? Then we got told, of course, it was a dead-end tunnel.
The train was normally 6 cars in length, and when one got on the platform, clearly visible was 3 cars, the rear 3 cars, with the 4th car halfway in a tunnel. The other 2 cars were actually crumpled up within that tunnel, and bearing in mind the cars are each 52 foot long, and the first 3 cars was compacted into a distance of some 78 feet.
The first car really bent into the shape of a V, with the front right up in the roof and the rear right up in the roof and the middle down on the track. The second car had ploughed underneath that raised rear of the first car. The third car was in fact very little damaged indeed. Its leading end was crushed, but its rear end was almost normal.
A makeshift medical unit joined the rescuers. The firemen had to clear away the bodies to get to the wounded. This involved crawling through the narrowest cracks amid thick dirt and suffocating dust. Over 4 long, hard days, the conditions steadily deteriorated.
It was an appalling situation to have these coaches jammed into this circular tube with a blind end with a concrete wall at that end. The coaches were squashed up to something like half their original length, folded in effect, folded up, concertinaed. Certainly a major problem at Moorgate was the amount of heat that built up in the accident area.
The only way the underground keeps its ventilation system is by having the trains moving and pushing the air and pulling the air through. So they kept the trains running. But when they did the hot cutting behind us, with a hot flame, it needs oxygen. So you had this convected current coming of hot air coming in, the oxygen being drawn out, and suddenly the temperature went up astronomical. And the actual breathability of the air went down to rock bottom.
Well, it's what you might call organised chaos. There's all the services are doing a marvellous job, but of course they're working in terrible conditions because the lighting has to be obviously made up lighting. They've got to climb through the carriages and cut their way through the carriages as they go. It's rather like a mine shaft. That's the best way to describe it, I think, like being in a coal mine.
Just imagine a tube train and you're in the centre aisle, but everything has been squashed in a little from the side, so it's very hard working conditions because you're trying to get people out that are trapped in by their legs, by the seats, and also by themselves. It's just, at the moment, right at the front is a jumble of people.
We were working on the casualties in a part that were piled up and tangled up in the remaining part of the carriage, and then we started hearing these moanings and groanings, and so we clambered up onto a roof and cut our way through into another compartment, which would be the front part plus the driver's cab, and we managed to free about 4 people not too seriously injured, and the remainder were dead.
If you can imagine like a disco lighting where it's a chopped vision. Every now and then you see a face, you see a face, you see a face. You're not getting the whole picture. So you're mentally confused about what you've got to do and how you've got to do it. And all of a sudden a hand came out. Got the hacksaw and I was going to saw a bit of metal. I thought I'd better do something here. And a hand came out and grabbed me. And I looked down and this hand grabbed my arm. And for a split second I thought, where'd that come from? Because, and then another hand grabbed me and I was being pulled in. They grabbed hold of my tunic and my torch and it was dark. It went black as, it was, the torch was, and everything went in very slow motion. And suddenly I was one of them. I knew exactly how they felt. They were trapped and they wanted to get out. I'd got in, they'd seen me shiny buttons, they'd seen the torch, and they thought, well, if you got in, you're going to get out, I'm going to be with you. And you ain't going to go out without leaving me, you're not going to leave me in here.
The train was packed tight with rush hour commuters when it smashed into the wall. Even after the first casualties had been rushed to hospital, 40 people were left trapped in the first 2 coaches alone. The dangers of fire meant that they had to be cut out with primitive hacksaws instead of the usual cutting equipment. 2 incidents played even further on the already stretched nerves of exhausted helpers. One was a bomb scare right in the middle of the rescue operation. The other was the action of a schoolmaster who put on a white coat and got to the crash scene, pretending to be a doctor. Identifying victims was a major problem. 43 people were killed, another 76 were hurt, the last one being cut free more than 13 hours after the crash. The last body to be removed was that of Leslie Newson. In his pocket was a wad of banknotes, more than £250. He was planning to buy a car for his daughter. The task of rescue over, the process of explanation began. First thoughts were to check everything mechanical, especially the brakes. But senior investigators from very early on were focusing on the behavior of the driver.
I formed the opinion that the question must have been one of driver error in some form or other within about a couple of hours of the crash occurring. And that was simply because we had by that time found out that there had apparently at least been no brake application, and not only that, but also that the train had approached the station clearly at a very much higher speed than is normal.
Underground trains of this era usually ran in groups of 3. A typical train, like Train 272, would have 2 3-car units joined by an automatic coupling. The main brake is on an electromagnetic system. On each car there are 16 brake cylinders, each getting air from a central brake unit in the middle of the car. This is all linked electrically. When the driver applies the brakes, it lets compressed air into the cylinders, so stopping the car and the train by way of brake blocks. There is also a fail-safe, the so-called Westinghouse system. This also lets air into the cylinders, but from a different reservoir. The system is triggered automatically by a number of possible causes. Perhaps the driver, a passenger pulling the emergency cord, or one of the various other emergency mechanisms.
We looked at every single piece of brake equipment on the train. In some cases, particularly in connection with the brake equipment in the leading cab, which was operational at the time, the equipment was actually recovered from the cab. It was tested, and then without dismantling it, it was put onto another train and actually tested in an emergency situation. And all I can say is all the pieces of equipment worked perfectly, and the train stopped as it should do in either an emergency situation or in using the Westinghouse brake as a low service brake.
The work done on the brake was confirming what rescue crews had already suspected. Train 272 had been mechanically perfectly sound. This meant that some sort of driver error had to be to blame. But in ruling out one set of causes, it meant that the mystery was still deeper. Could a happy, healthy man just drive a train at 35 miles an hour straight into a brick wall? The horror of what was being suggested seemed incredible. But the rescue men had to get at the driver's cab before investigators could fully get at the truth. The obvious way would be to get round the front, but that was impossible through the mass of tangled, distorted metal at the tunnel end.
In fact, you couldn't get round the front because the front was crushed against the head wall of the train. So it wasn't until the Tuesday after the event until we could actually winch the vehicle back sufficiently to see into that cab. The driver was there still. His hands were on the brake and on the master controller, and what we were particularly able to see was the condition of all the controls and the various switches.
One vital piece of evidence they were searching for was what's called the dead man's handle. If a driver had fallen asleep or was daydreaming, his hand should slip off the handle and the emergency Westinghouse brake would be operated.
This handle here is the dead man's handle and is the master controller. In other words, it controls all the power on the train. If you ever lose pressure on this handle while you're running, it will shoot up like that and give you an emergency brake application and cut off the power.
But when they found the dead man's handle, as with everything else, there seemed nothing wrong. So the first instant investigations had ruled out any electrical or mechanical cause for the Moorgate disaster. In the weeks to come, London transport experts sifted through every bit of evidence. There was no rational explanation of Leslie Newson's actions, but there was no indication of any other factor either. They had found nothing to change their first conclusions.
Firstly, I think that we could find nothing radically wrong with any of the 6 brake equipments on the train, and we checked them all thoroughly. 1 or 2 had minor valves were leaking slightly, but nothing to cause the train performance to be affected in any shape or form. Secondly, that the control equipment in the cab was, in our view, in perfect working order. And thirdly, and probably the key one was, in our view, he had made no attempt whatsoever to apply the brakes. In fact, in our view, he was still motoring.
The single most important detail of the investigation and single most important finding of the investigation was that the camshaft on the first car had been wedged in an intermediate position. In fact, it was between notches 2 and 3. That showed that the train must have been motoring, in other words, under power, up to approximately 1.5 to 2.5 seconds before the impact. That really showed that no attempt had been made to switch the power off and apply the brake.
Both official inquiry and inquest had to seek some other explanation. There had been alcohol found in driver Newson's blood. So had he been drunk? Dr. Roy Golding, a prominent poisons expert, spoke for the overwhelming body of medical opinion when he ruled this out. Newson had not been a known drinker, and the alcohol was almost certainly a chemical reaction in the body. Was suicide an option?
I think we have to rule suicide out. Nobody reported him as being depressed. His wife said he was quite well. He had money in his pocket to buy his daughter a car. He even had commented to one of his friends that he didn't want too much milk used because he was going to have tea later on. So it looks as if he was looking forward.
This would not have been just an ordinary suicide. It would have been an act of revenge against society at large. It could only have been undertaken by somebody who was nursing some terrible secret grudge and wanted to take as many other people to their deaths with him at the same time as he committed suicide. Now that of course, is a very, very unusual state of mind indeed, and there was no evidence of that at all.
Inevitably, a few doubts still lingered, but the inquest supported neither drink or suicide as an explanation. But before going deeper into medical theories, one more mundane suggestion had to be tackled.
If the driver had been daydreaming or just dropped off, as one does sometimes, I must admit, when I'm driving a motor car, these seats on this particular stock are not all that comfortable, and they have no side restraining, and the train is going to go over a crossover to get into the northbound platform, having come down the southbound line. As it goes through that crossover, which is a low-speed crossover, in other words, it's quite short, it doesn't have a gentle curve, it has quite a sharp series of reverse curves, the train will lurch to one side and then lurch to the other side, particularly the leading cab, quite violently, and he almost certainly would topple off the seat, or at least go over and bring himself up awake rather suddenly, and then seize the brake handle, no doubt, and put it on.
I really can't believe that someone can go full speed through a station and not even put their hands in front of their face if they suddenly realise the mistake they have made, because it was quite clear from the photographs taken of him when he was reached in his cab that he was sitting at the controls as if he was driving the train. His hand was on the master controller, his right hand, and his left hand was on top of or near the brake controller, as if poised to make a brake application.
At the inquest, 2 medical explanations were raised.
The 2 conditions mentioned in the inquest were transient global amnesia and akinetic mutism. Transient global amnesia is a condition of the brain in which the blood supply to that part of the brain which controls memory is cut off.
This happens in the temporal lobe at the front of the brain.
Now, I've had patients who, during such an attack, can maintain complex actions. For example, they can continue driving cars. So, although it is a remote possibility, I don't think it's a serious one. The other one was akinetic mutism.
Akinetic mutism affects the whole brain. It's almost like an electrical storm inside someone's head.
Now, I think neurologically this is just not a runner for this condition. I don't think it's possible. The most likely explanation of his behavior from my point of view, and remember that at this distance in time it's terribly difficult to second guess the inquest, is I think he probably had a temporal lobe seizure. That is a condition when you get an epileptic fit passing through the temporal lobe of the brain. Now, in that, you retain body posture and you become quite out of touch. And the description of him driving the train, rigid in his seat, looking straight ahead, not responding to any cues, would do exactly for a temporal lobe seizure.
Presumably, there was some form of amnesia, unconsciousness, or something, but the doctors have been almost as divided in their opinions as to possibilities as we laymen.
Today, the Moorgate line has been taken over by the main rail network. Managers like David Hindhoff have seen changes in the signalling and safety procedures, which should ensure there is never another Moorgate-type crash.
The driver must now reduce the speed of the train to 20 miles an hour. And we now have to reduce the speed of the train to 10 miles an hour. From here all the way to the end of the platform is a series of spaced out tripping devices that if the driver exceeds a speed of just over 10 miles an hour, the brakes will be applied. These tripping devices are timed and will only drop if the driver keeps his speed to 10 miles an hour. And we're now still approaching the down platform. The tripping devices can be seen on the right-hand side between the two rails. You will see that they will start to drop as we get near them. A train doing more than 10 miles an hour is going to get tripped. If the driver remains at 10 miles an hour towards the end of the platform, the very last tripping mechanism is fixed. It will not drop. It will trip the train whatever happens.
So, security today, but still no answer to what happened 22 or more years ago.
My only answer to that question is that I believe the cause of the accident died with the driver.